1A. Spirits in the Sand. Recent findings shed light on the lives and mysterious disappearance of the ancient Nazcar. Since their mysterious desert drawings became widely known in the late 1920s, people known as the Nazcar have puzzled archaeologists, anthropologists, and anyone else who is fascinated by ancient cultures. Their elaborate lines and figures, called geoglyphs, are found distributed seemingly at random across the desert outside Nazcar and the nearby town of Palpa. Waves of scientists and amateurs have come up with various interpretations for the designs. At one time or another, they have been explained as Inca roads, irrigation plans, even, controversially, landing strips for alien spacecraft. Since 1997, an ongoing Peruvian-German research collaboration called the Nazcar Palpa Project has been putting these theories to the test. The leaders of the project are Johnny Eila and Marcus Riendell of the German Archaeological Institute. As well as studying where and how the Nazcar lived, the researchers have investigated why they disappeared and the meaning of the strange, abstract designs they left behind. If Eila and his colleagues are right, the story of Nazcar begins and ends with water. Living on the Edge. The coastal region of southern Peru and northern Chile is one of the driest places on Earth. In the small, protected basin where the Nazcar culture arose, 10 rivers descend from the Andes. Most of these rivers are dry at least part of the year. Surrounded by 1,000 shades of brown, these 10 ribbons of green offered a fertile spot for the emergence of an early civilization. It was the perfect place for human settlement because it had water, says geographer Bernhard Eitel, a member of the Nazcar Palpa Project. But it was a very high-risk environment. According to Eitel and his colleague Bertel Machtel, the microclimate in the Nazcar region has undergone considerable variation over the past 5,000 years. When a high-pressure system over central South America called the Bolivian High moves to the north, more rain falls on the western slopes of the Andes. When the high shifts southward, precipitation decreases. This causes the rivers in the Nazcar valleys to run dry. Despite the risky conditions, the Nazcar lived in the area for 8 centuries, following their appearance in about 300 BC. As the rainfall cycle continued, people moved east or west along the river valleys. In the arid southern valleys, early Nazcar engineers devised practical ways of coping with the scarcity of water. An ingenious system of horizontal wells tapped into the inclined water table as it descended from the Andean foothills. These irrigation systems, or puquios, allowed the Nazcar to bring subterranean water to the surface. The Nazcar people were, in fact, remarkably green, perhaps because of the environmental challenges they faced. The creation of the puquios displayed a sophisticated sense of water conservation, since the underground aqueducts minimized evaporation. The farmers planted seeds by making a single hole in the ground rather than plowing, thereby preserving the substructure of the soil. The Nazcar also recycled their garbage as building material. It's a society that managed its resources very well, says Eila. This is what Nazcar is all about. Praying for water. For centuries, Andean people have worshipped the gods of mountains that feed the Nazcar drainage system. According to National Geographic explorer Johann Reinhardt, the Nazcar have traditionally associated these mountains mythologically, if not geologically, with water. Evidence for Reinhardt's thesis came in 1986 when he found the ruins of a ceremonial stone circle at the summit of Ilocata, one of the region's tallest mountains. Reinhardt believes the Nazcar lines were most likely related to worship of mountain gods because of their connection to water. Further evidence connecting Nazcar rituals to water worship was revealed by the NASCAR Pawpaw Project researchers in 2000. On a plateau near the village of Unima, Marcus Ryandel made an important discovery. As he was excavating a mound, he uncovered several broken pots and other relics that clearly represented ritual offerings. Then he came upon pieces of a large seashell. It was of a genus called Spondylus. The Spondylus shell is one of the few items of Andean archaeology that has been well studied, Ryandel says. It's a very important religious symbol for water and fertility. It was brought from far away and is found in specific contexts, such as funerary objects and on these platforms. It was connected in certain activities to praying for water. And it's clear in this area, water was the key issue. In 2004, archaeologist Christina Conley made a much grimmer discovery. Conley was working at a site near a dry river valley in the southern Nazca region. While excavating a Nazca tomb, she unearthed the skeleton. However, the first part to emerge from the dirt was not the skull, but the neck bones. We could see the vertebrae sitting on top, Conley says. The person was seated, with arms crossed and legs crossed, and no head. Cut marks on the neck bones indicate the head had probably been severed by a sharp knife. A ceramic pot known as a head jar rested against the elbow of the skeleton. An illustration on the jar showed a decapitated trophy head. Out of the head grew a strange tree trunk with eyes. Everything about the burial, the head jar, the placement, and position of the body suggest the body was disposed of in a careful manner. Conley suspects the skeleton represents a ritual sacrifice. Although we find trophy heads spread throughout the Nazca period, she said, there are some indications that they became more common in the Middle and Late period, and also at times of great environmental stress, perhaps drought. If this was a sacrifice, it was made to appease the gods, perhaps because of a drought or crop failure. Beginning of the end. Despite their offerings, the Nazca prayers would ultimately go unanswered. Water, or more precisely, its absence, was increasingly critical in the Nazca's final years, between about AD 500 and 600. In the Pampa area, scientists have traced the movement of the eastern margin of the desert about 19 kilometers, 12 miles, up the valleys between 200 BC and AD 600. At one point, the desert reached an altitude of over 1,900 meters, 6,500 feet. Similarly, the population centers around Pampa moved farther up the valleys, as if they were trying to outrun the arid conditions. At the end of the 6th century AD, Idle and Machtel concluded in a recent paper, the aridity culminated and the Nazca society collapsed. Nevertheless, environmental stresses were not the only vital factor. It wasn't just climate conditions that caused the collapse of Nazca culture, emphasizes Johnny Isla. A state of crisis was provoked because water was more prevalent in some valleys than in others, and the leaders of different valleys may have been in conflict. By about AD 650, the more militaristic Wari Empire had emerged from the central highlands and displaced the Nazca as the predominant culture in the southern desert region. Almost 1,500 years later, the legacy of the Nazca lives on. You can see it in the artifacts of their ancient rituals, in the remains of their irrigation systems, and, most famously, in the lines of their mysterious desert designs. The lines surely provided a ritualistic reminder to the Nazca people that their fate was intrinsically tied to their environment. In particular, the lines represent a bond with the Nazca's most precious resource, water. You can still read their reverence for nature, in times of plenty and in times of desperate want, in every line and curve they scratched onto the desert floor. And when your feet inhabit their sacred space, even for a brief and humbling moment, you can feel it.
1b. The collapse of Angkor. After rising to sublime heights, the sacred city may have engineered its own downfall. Almost hidden amidst the forests of northern Cambodia is the scene of one of the greatest vanishing acts of all time. This was once the heart of the Khmer kingdom, which lasted from the 9th to the 15th centuries. At its height, the Khmer Empire dominated much of Southeast Asia, from Myanmar, Burma, in the west, to Vietnam in the east. As many as 750,000 people lived in Angkor, its magnificent capital. The most extensive urban complex of the pre-industrial world, Angkor stretched across an area the size of New York City. Its greatest temple, Angkor Wat, is the world's largest religious monument, even today. Yet when the first European missionaries arrived in Angkor in the late 16th century, they found a city that was already dying. Scholars have come up with a long list of suspected causes for Angkor's decline. These include foreign invaders, a religious change of heart, and a shift to maritime trade. But it's mostly guesswork. Roughly 1,300 inscriptions survive on temple doors and monuments, but the people of Angkor left not a single word explaining their kingdom's collapse. Some scholars assume that Angkor died the way it lived, by the sword. The historical records of Ayutthaya, a neighboring state, claim that warriors from that kingdom took Angkor in 1431. If so, their motive is not difficult to guess. No doubt Angkor would have been a rich prize. Inscriptions boast that its temple towers were covered with gold. After its rediscovery by Western travelers just over a century ago, historians deduced from Angkor's ruins that the city had been looted by invaders from Ayutthaya. Roland Fletcher, co-director of a research effort called the Greater Angkor Project, is not convinced. Some early scholars, he says, viewed Angkor according to the sieges and conquests of European history. The ruler of Ayutthaya, indeed, says he took Angkor, and he may have taken some formal regalia back to Ayutthaya with him, says Fletcher. But after Angkor was captured, Ayutthaya's ruler placed his son on the throne. He's not likely to have smashed the place up before giving it to his son. A religious shift may have also contributed to the city's decline by diminishing royal authority. Angkor was a regal ritual city. Its kings claimed to be the world emperors of Hindu mythology and erected temples to themselves. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, Theravada Buddhism gradually took over from Hinduism. Its principles of social equality may have threatened Angkor's elite. It was very subversive, just like Christianity was subversive to the Roman Empire, says Fletcher. The regal ritual city operated on a moneyless economy, relying on tribute and taxation. The kingdom's main currency was rice, the staple food of the laborers who built the temples and the thousands who ran them. At one temple complex, Ta Prohm, more than 66,000 farmers produced nearly 3,000 tons of rice a year. This was then used to feed the temple's priests, dancers, and workers. Scholars estimate that farm laborers comprised nearly half of Greater Angkor's population. A new religion that promoted ideas of social equality might have led to rebellion. Or maybe the royal court simply turned its back on Angkor. Angkor's rulers often erected new temple complexes and let older ones decay. This may have doomed the city when sea trade began to develop between Southeast Asia and China. Maybe it was simple economic opportunism that, by the 16th century, had caused the Khmer center of power to shift. The move to a location closer to the Mekong River near Cambodia's present-day capital, Phnom Penh, allowed it easier access to the South China Sea. Economic and religious changes may have contributed to Angkor's downfall. But its rulers faced another foe. Angkor was powerful largely thanks to an advanced system of canals and reservoirs. These enabled the city to keep scarce water in dry months and disperse excess water during the rainy season. But forces beyond Angkor's control would eventually bring an end to this carefully constructed rational system. Few ancient sites in southern Asia could compare to Angkor in its ability to guarantee a steady water supply. That reliability required massive feats of engineering. The first scholar to appreciate the scale of Angkor's waterworks was French archaeologist Bernard-Philippe Grolier. In 1979, he argued that the great reservoirs, or barrages, served two purposes: to symbolize the Hindu cosmos and to irrigate the rice fields. Unfortunately, Grolier could not pursue his ideas further. Cambodia's civil war, the brutal regime of the Khmer Rouge, and the subsequent arrival of Vietnamese forces in 1979 turned Angkor into a no-go zone for 2 decades. Then, in 2000, Roland Fletcher and his colleague Damien Evans saw some NASA radar images of Angkor. The researchers marveled at the sophistication of Angkor's infrastructure. We realized that the entire landscape of Greater Angkor is artificial, Fletcher says. Teams of laborers constructed hundreds of kilometers of canals and dikes that diverted water from the rivers to the barrages. Overflow channels bled off excess water that accumulated during the summer monsoon months. After the monsoon, irrigation channels dispensed the stored water. It was an incredibly clever system, says Fletcher. Fletcher was therefore baffled when his team made a surprising discovery. An extraordinary piece of Angkorian workmanship, a vast structure in the waterworks, had been destroyed, apparently by Angkor's own engineers. The most logical explanation is that the dam failed, Fletcher says. The river may have begun to erode the dam, or perhaps it was washed away by an unusually heavy flood. The Khmer broke apart the remaining stonework and modified the blocks for other purposes. Any weakening of the waterworks would have left the city vulnerable to a natural phenomenon that none of Angkor's engineers could have predicted. Starting in the 1300s, it appears that Southeast Asia experienced a period of extreme climate change which also affected other parts of the world. In Europe, which endured centuries of harsh winters and cool summers, it was known as the Little Ice Age. To an already weakened kingdom, extreme weather would have been the final blow. Decades earlier, Angkor's waterworks were already struggling. We don't know why the water system was operating below capacity, says Daniel Penny, co-director of the Greater Angkor Project. But what it means is that Angkor was more exposed to the threat of drought than at any other time in its history. If inhabitants of parts of Angkor were starving while other parts of the city were hoarding a finite quantity of rice, the most likely result was social instability. When populations in tropical countries exceed the carrying capacity of the land, real trouble begins, says Yale University anthropologist Michael Coe. This inevitably leads to cultural collapse. A hungry army weakened by internal problems would have exposed the city to attack. Indeed, Ayutthaya's invasion happened near the end of a long period of drought. Add to the climate chaos the political and religious changes already affecting the kingdom, and Angkor's prospects were bleak, says Fletcher. The world around Angkor was changing. Society was moving on. It would have been a surprise if Angkor persisted. The Khmer Empire was not the first civilization brought down by climate catastrophe. Centuries earlier, loss of environmental stability likewise brought down another powerful kingdom halfway around the world. Many scholars now believe that the fall of the Maya city-states in Mexico and Central America followed a series of droughts in the 9th century. Essentially, the same thing happened to Angkor, says Ko, who in the 1950s was the first to detect similarities between the Khmer and Maya civilizations. In the end, the tale of Angkor is a sobering lesson in the limits of human ingenuity. Angkor's hydraulic system was an amazing machine, a wonderful mechanism for regulating the world, Fletcher says. Its engineers managed to keep the civilization's achievement running for 6 centuries, until a greater force overwhelmed them.
To A. Cosmic Vision. A new generation of giant telescopes will carry the eye to the edge of the universe. When people start stargazing with the telescope, they are typically first astonished by the view. Saturn's golden rings appear in fine detail. Star clusters glitter like jewelry on black velvet. Galaxies glow with gentle starlight older than the human species. The view brings home the realization that we and our world are an integral part of a gigantic system. That's the initial reaction. The next is a desire for a bigger telescope. The first person to point a telescope at the night sky was Galileo, roughly 400 years ago. With this telescope, Galileo was able to chart 4 bright satellites as they moved around Jupiter, like planets in a miniature solar system, something that contemporary critics had dismissed as physically impossible. Galileo's telescope also revealed thousands of previously invisible stars. When he tried to map all of them in just one constellation, Orion, he gave up, confessing that he was overwhelmed by the vast quantity of stars. Evidently, the Earth was a small part of a big universe, not a big part of a small one. Some 6 decades later, Isaac Newton pioneered a new kind of telescope, the reflecting telescope. This made it possible to obtain a much clearer view of the universe. Mirrors required that only one surface be used to reflect starlight to a focal point. Since the mirror was supported from behind, it could be quite large without sagging under its own weight, as large lenses tended to do. It was with such a reflecting telescope that William Herschel discovered the planet Uranus in 1781. 6 decades later, Lord Rosse built a massive reflecting telescope called Leviathan on his estate in Ireland. This allowed Rosse to become the first person to observe spiral-armed galaxies beyond the Milky Way. Today's largest telescopes have mirrors up to some 10 meters, 33 feet in diameter, more than 5 times the size of Leviathan. Some are as large as office buildings and highly automated. They can clean dust off their optics, open their dome, carry out observations throughout the night, and shut down in the event of threatening weather, all with little or no human intervention. 3 of today's largest telescopes, Gemini North, Subaru, and Keck, stand within a short distance of one another atop Hawaii's Mauna Kea, an inactive volcano. Surprisingly, Subaru is one of the few giant telescopes that anybody has ever actually looked through. Most astronomers choose to view a telescope's findings via a computer screen. For its inauguration in 1999, an eyepiece was attached so that Princess Sayoko of Japan could look through the telescope. For several nights afterward, eager Subaru staffers did the same. Everything you can see in the Hubble Space Telescope photos, the colors, the clouds, I could see with my own eyes in stunning Technicolor, one recalled. In addition to their light-gathering power, today's big telescopes benefit from their adaptive optics, AO systems, which compensate for atmospheric turbulence, the reason why stars glitter. Starting in 1995, astronomer Andrea Ghez has been able to use Keck's AO system to make a motion picture of 7 bright stars spinning around the invisible black hole at the center of our galaxy. has used simulations of the dynamic movement of stars in the grip of the black hole to calculate that it has a mass of 4 million suns. That's enough gravitational force to throw passing stars right out of our galaxy. What's next? Enhanced, even bigger telescopes, of course, with the capability to shoot cosmic pictures faster, wider, and in even greater detail. Particularly innovative is the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, or LSST. The LSST will have a field of view covering an area the size of 50 full moons. From its site in the Chilean Andes, it will be able to capture sequences of events at distances of over 10 billion light-years, 70% of the way across the observable universe. Since we'll have a big field of view, we can take a whole lot of short exposures and bang, 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 cover the entire visible sky every several nights and then repeat, says LSST Director Tony Tyson. If you keep doing that for 10 years, you have a movie, the first movie of the universe. The LSST's fast, wide-angle imaging could help answer two of the biggest questions confronting astronomers today: the nature of dark matter and of dark energy. Dark matter makes its presence known by its gravitational attraction. It explains the rotation speed of galaxies. But it gives out no light, and its constitution is unknown. Dark energy is the name given to the mysterious phenomenon that, for the past 5 billion years, has been accelerating the rate at which the universe expands. It's a little bit scary, says Tyson, as if you were flying an airplane and suddenly something unknown took over the controls. Orbiting space telescopes are opening up another dimension. NASA's Kepler satellite, which launched in March 2009, is methodically imaging the constellation Cygnus. Its mission is to look for the slight dimming of light caused when planets, some perhaps Earth-like, transit in front of their stars. Astronomers will then use Keck to analyze the stars identified by Kepler. They hope this will confirm the existence of planets. In the future, pairs of orbiting mirrors linked by laser ranging systems could attain the power of telescopes measuring thousands of meters across. One day, observatories may sit in craters on the far side of the moon, probing the universe from surroundings ideally quiet, dark, and cold. Film directors like to say that each movie is really two movies: the one you make and the one you say you're going to make while raising the money. The point is that nobody can accurately predict the outcome of any genuinely creative venture. The same is true of most scientific discoveries. Scientists can explain what they expect to accomplish with bigger and better telescopes, but such predictions are mostly just extrapolations from the past. If you're going to Washington to seek funding for a new telescope and you make a list of what you'll see through this new window on the universe, you know that the most interesting thing it will discover is probably not on your list, says Tyson. It's likely to be something totally new, some out-of-the-box physics that's going to blow our minds. The marvelous model of the Big Bang universe, pieced together in the 20th century, arose largely from just such unanticipated discoveries. Edwin Hubble discovered the expansion of the universe accidentally at the telescope. Cosmic expansion had been implied by Einstein's general theory of relativity. But Hubble knew nothing of the prediction, and not even Einstein had taken it seriously. Dark matter was discovered accidentally. So was dark energy. A telescope doesn't just show you what's out there. It impresses upon you how little you know. As Galileo said, the spyglass is very truthful. It has the power to give us new insights and to open our imagination to wonders as big as all outdoors.
To be. Are we alone? Throughout history, only one Earth has been known to exist in the universe. Soon there may be another, and another, and another. It took humans thousands of years to explore our own planet and centuries to comprehend our neighboring planets. Nowadays, new worlds are being discovered every week. To date, astronomers have identified more than 370 exoplanets, worlds orbiting stars other than the Sun. There's a hot Saturn, 260 light-years from Earth, that orbits its parent star so rapidly that a year there lasts less than 3 days. Circling another star 150 light-years out is a scorched hot Jupiter, whose upper atmosphere is being blasted off to form a gigantic comet-like tail. Astronomers have found 3 planets orbiting a pulsar, the remains of a once mighty star shrunk into a spinning atomic nucleus the size of a city. Some worlds have evidently fallen into their suns. Others have been thrown out of their systems to become floaters that wander in eternal darkness. Among all these, scientists are eager to find a hint of the familiar, planets resembling Earth. That is, planets orbiting their stars at just the right distance, neither too hot nor too cold, to support life as we know it. We have not yet found planets that are quite like our own, presumably because they are inconspicuous. To see a planet as small and dim as ours amid the glare of its star is like trying to see a firefly in a fireworks display. Yet by pushing technology to the limits, astronomers are rapidly approaching the day when they can find another Earth, and when they do, they can investigate it for signs of life. In search of other Earths. The most direct approach to finding a planet is to take a picture of it with a telescope. At the time of writing, astronomers had detected only 11 exoplanets this way. All of them are big and bright and conveniently far away from their stars. The most effective way to detect an exoplanet, though, is to use a method known as the Doppler technique. This involves analyzing starlight for evidence that the star is being pulled by the gravitational pull of its planets. In recent years, astronomers have refined the technique to a fine degree. Now they can tell when a planet is pulling its star by only 1 meter a second, about human walking speed. That's sufficient to detect a giant planet in a big orbit or a small one if it's close to its star. But the Earth tugs the Sun around at only 1/10 walking speed, or about the rate that an infant can crawl. So far, astronomers are not able to detect so tiny a signal. Another approach is to watch a star for a slight periodic dip in its brightness. This occurs when an orbiting planet passes in front of it and blocks a fraction of its light. At most, 1/10 of all planetary systems are oriented so that these mini eclipses, called transits, are visible from Earth. So astronomers have to monitor a lot of stars to capture just a few transits. The dream of astronomers is to discover a rocky planet roughly the size of Earth orbiting in a habitable zone. That is, not so close to a star that the planet's water has been baked away, nor so far out that it has frozen into ice. If they succeed, they will have found what biologists believe could be a promising abode for life. The best hunting grounds may be dwarf stars, smaller than the Sun. Firstly, dwarf stars are plentiful. 7 of the 10 stars nearest to Earth are dwarf stars. They also provide a steady supply of sunlight to any life-bearing planets within their habitable zone. Additionally, dwarf stars are dim, and so the habitable zone lies closer in. Imagine dwarf stars as small campfires where campers must sit close to be comfortable. If the planet is closer to the star, it's easier for astronomers to detect a transit observation. A close-in planet also exerts a stronger pull on its star. That makes it easier to detect with the Doppler method. Indeed, the most promising planet yet found, the super-Earth Gliese 581d, orbits in the habitable zone of a red dwarf star only a third the mass of the Sun. Life, but not as we know it. If an Earth-like planet is found within a star's habitable zone, a dedicated space telescope could be used to look for signs of life. Most likely, scientists will examine the light coming from the planet for possible biosignatures, such as atmospheric methane and oxygen. They might also look for the red edge produced when chlorophyll-containing plants reflect red light. Directly detecting and analyzing the planet's own light will not be easy. Its light might be just 1/10,000,000th the light of the stars. But when a planet transits, starlight shining through the atmosphere could reveal clues to its composition that a space telescope might be able to detect. The challenge facing scientists is not just having to perform a chemical analysis of planets they cannot see. Scientists must also keep in mind that extraterrestrial life may be very different from life here at home. The lack of the red edge from an exoplanet, for instance, does not exclude the possibility of life. Life thrived on Earth for billions of years before land plants appeared and populated the continents. The problem for scientists is that biological evolution is inherently unpredictable. It is possible that life originated on an Earth-like planet at the same time it did here, but life on that planet today would almost certainly be very different from terrestrial life. As the biologist Jacques Monod once commented, life evolves not only through necessity, the universal workings of natural law, but also through chance, the unpredictable intervention of countless accidents. Chance has played a role many times in our planet's history. The most dramatic examples are the mass extinctions that wiped out millions of species and created room for new life forms to evolve. Some of these accidents appear to have been caused by comets or asteroids colliding with Earth. An impact 65 million years ago, for instance, helped kill off the dinosaurs and opened up opportunities for the distant ancestors of human beings. Hence, scientists look not just for exoplanets identical to the modern Earth, but for planets resembling the Earth as it used to be or might have been. It was not easy for earlier pioneers to undertake explorations of the ocean floors, map the far side of the moon, or discern evidence of oceans beneath the frozen surfaces of Jupiter's moons. Neither will it be easy to find life on the planets of other stars. But we now have reason to believe that billions of such planets must exist. They hold the promise of expanding not only the scope of human knowledge, but also the richness of the human imagination.
(3A) Mending Broken Hearts. Cheeseburgers, smoking, stress. These are the prime suspects on the list of risk factors for heart disease, a global problem reaching epidemic proportions. Now, discoveries about genetic triggers may help us spot trouble before it starts. Don Stephenson was putting duck hunting decoys out on a small lake one fall afternoon in southwestern Iowa when his heart attack hit. The attack was massive and unexpected. It's likely that Stephenson survived only because a friend was carrying nitroglycerin tablets and quickly slipped one under his tongue. The Stephenson clan is enormous, more than 200 relatives spread over 3 generations. Although heart trouble is common in the family, it had never seemed unusual. The Stephensons were raised on the kind of farm food that the state is famous for: ham balls, meatloaf, pie, macaroni, and cheese. But could the high incidence of heart trouble among the Stephensons be related to something else besides high-fat diets? 11 years after Don's attack, his wife, Barbara, happened to overhear a doctor describing a study about the genetics of heart attacks. Curious, Don and 20 of his relatives each submitted a sample of blood to the Cleveland Clinic, where the research was being conducted. Eric Topol, a cardiologist and genetics researcher at the clinic, spent a year studying their DNA. Each person's genome has millions of individual variations, but Topol was looking for something distinctive. The mutation he and his team finally spotted in a gene called MEF2A produced a faulty protein. We knew we had something, Topol says, but the question was, how does the sick protein, present at birth, lead to heart attacks 50 years later in life? Topol himself is lean and weathered in a cowboyish way. He talks slowly and eats minimally. Salads for dinner and high-fiber cereal for breakfast. He doesn't eat lunch at all. People have looked at the cadavers of men in their 20s who died in car accidents or as casualties of war, and nearly all had arterial cholesterol deposits, Topol says. This disease starts much earlier than people realize. Topol's study did find that although dysfunctional MEF2A is very rare, the chance of heart disease in those carrying it may approach 100%. Most other genetic variations identified thus far increase the risk by much less. Heart disease is not a 1 or 2 gene problem, says Stephen Ellis, a Cleveland Clinic cardiologist. Ellis oversees a genetic study that collects DNA samples from patients who enter hospitals with atherosclerosis. Ellis, like most cardiac researchers, suspects that dozens of genes contribute to a predisposition to heart disease. Of the several dozen genes, each may contribute just 1% to a person's total risk, an amount that may be compounded or offset by outside factors like diet. As one doctor commented, any person's heart attack risk is 50% genetic and 50% cheeseburger. The point of tracking down all these small mutations, Ellis explains, is to create a comprehensive blood test, one that could calculate a person's genetic susceptibility by adding up the number of risky and eventually beneficial variables. Combined with other important factors such as smoking, weight, blood pressure, and cholesterol levels, doctors could decide which patients need aggressive treatment, such as high-dose statins, and which ones are likely to benefit from exercise or other lifestyle changes. Some genes can already predict whose cholesterol level will respond strongly to dietary changes and whose won't. Assessing risk is crucial, Ellis says, because heart disease is often invisible. 50% of men and 64% of women who die of heart disease die suddenly, without experiencing any previous symptoms. Although standard tests can detect atherosclerosis, they aren't foolproof. They may reveal plaques, but give no indication whether or not they are life-threatening. Tests like angiography, for example, in which doctors inject a dye into the bloodstream and track it with X-rays, can show how much blood is flowing through an artery, but not discern the plaques embedded inside the artery wall, often the principal culprit in a heart attack. Until there are tests, genetic or otherwise, that give a clearer measure of risk, everyone would be advised to exercise, watch their diet, and take statins for elevated cholesterol. The same advice doctors gave when the clogged pipes model of heart disease was unchallenged. But statins, like any drug, carry the risk of side effects. Muscle aches are a well-known effect, and periodic blood tests to check liver function are recommended. The fact is, many of us just like to eat cheeseburgers, lie back and watch TV, and get around in cars. And it's hard, says Leslie Cho, a director at the Cleveland Clinic, for a person to worry about a disease that hits 10 years down the road, particularly since heart patients, unlike cancer patients, can't easily observe the progress of their disease. You've done damage over years, and it will take years to undo that damage. That's a very hard thing to sell, she says. We do what we can, but then people go home. The good news is that genetic research continues to thrive. Should we want to, we will soon be able to know the state of our hearts and our genes in ever-growing detail. That knowledge and what we do with it could make the difference between dying at 65 and living until 80. The choice, increasingly, will be ours. Clogged pipes and ruptured walls. Worldwide, coronary heart disease kills 7.2 million people every year. Exacerbated by the export of Western lifestyle, motorized transport, abundant meat and cheese, workdays conducted from the comfort of a well-padded chair, incidence of the disease is soaring. Until recently, cardiologists approached heart disease as a plumbing problem. Just as mineral deposits restrict the flow of water through a pipe, a buildup of plaque impedes the flow of blood through an arterial channel. Doctors now dismiss this clogged pipes model as an idea whose time has passed. It's just not that simple. Most heart attacks are caused by plaque embedded within the artery wall that ruptures, cracking the wall and triggering the formation of a blood clot. The clot reduces the volume of blood flowing to the heart muscle, which can die from lack of oxygen and nutrients. Suddenly, the pump stops pumping. Contrary to the clogged pipes model, heart attacks generally occur in arteries that have minimal or moderate blockage, and their occurrence depends more on the kind of plaque than on the quantity. Findings suggest that softer plaques, rich in cholesterol, are more unstable and likely to rupture than the hard, dense plaques that extensively narrow the artery channel. But understanding the root cause of the disease will require much more research.
(3b) The War on Allergies. Millions suffer from them and thousands die each year. The rising incidence of allergies is nothing to sneeze at. Suppose that 54.3% of your country's population had cancer. That figure might set off a nationwide panic, a search for something wrong with people's diet, the environment, activity levels. In fact, that's the percentage of Americans who show a positive skin response to one or more allergens. The manifestations of allergy, sneezing, itching, rashes, are signs of an immune system running amok, attacking foreign invaders, allergens that mean no harm. Allergens include pollen, dust mites, mold, food, drugs, stinging insects, or any other substance to which the body can choose to react or overreact. Allergies rarely kill. They just make the sufferer miserable, sometimes for brief periods and sometimes for life. Allergies are essentially an epidemic of modernity. As countries become more industrialized, the percentage of population affected by them tends to grow higher. There are remote areas of South America or Africa where allergies are virtually non-existent. In contrast, 6% of young children in the U.S. today have food allergies. Federal legislation requires manufacturers to clearly label whether major allergens, peanuts, soy, shellfish, eggs, wheat, milk, fish, and tree nuts are ingredients in any product. Children sit at special tables at lunchtime. There are websites and support groups for parents homeschooling their severely allergic children. Here's how an allergy develops. One day, a body is exposed to a protein in something that seems perfectly harmless, the wheat flour, say, in a home-baked muffin. But for some unclear reason, the body looks at the protein and sees trouble. There will be no symptoms at first, but the body is remembering and planning. That first exposure causes the immune system to produce an antibody called IgE, immunoglobulin E. Then IgE antibodies attach to certain cells called mast cells in tissue throughout the body. There they stay like wary soldiers waiting for war. With a second exposure, even months later, some of the allergen binds with the IgE on the mast cell. This time, the mast cell releases a flood of irritating chemicals which cause inflammation and itching. A minor or isolated reaction can become more serious with repeated exposure to an allergen, or when other cells involved in the immune system, the T cells, come into play. Certain T cells remember the insult of the allergen and ensure that some part of the body keeps becoming inflamed. Often the allergen and the immune system become increasingly antagonistic and the reaction worsens. There is unquestionably a hereditary component to allergies. A child with one asthmatic parent has a good chance of developing the condition. If both parents have asthma, the chance of occurrence increases. Still, the rise in allergies is too rapid to be explained solely by genetics. The genetic pool can't change that much in such a short time, says Donald Leung, director of an allergy immunology program in the U.S. There have to be environmental and behavioral factors as well. Dozens of theories have blamed everyone from urban landscapers for favoring male plants, the ones that produce pollen, to women who don't breastfeed. Breastfeeding, the theory goes, confers greater protection against allergies. Another probable factor, diet. Reduced fresh fruit and vegetable intake, more processed food, fewer antioxidants, and low intake of some minerals. These are all shown to be a risk, says Professor of Medicine Harold Nelson, considered one of the foremost experts on allergies in the U.S. The use of antibiotics may also be an underlying cause of rising allergy rates. Certain bacteria in the intestine are associated with greater or lesser chances of having allergies. Researchers believe, as Donald Leung says, overuse of antibiotics may be disrupting certain gut flora that suppress allergy. Another prime culprit, environmental pollutants. Exactly what pollutants and in what quantities are a source of heated debate. One of dozens of examples. Children who are raised near major highways and are exposed to diesel fumes from trucks register an increased sensitivity to allergens they already react to. Ironically, it's not just the pollutants that are doing us in. It may be too much cleanliness. A prevalent theory among allergists is known as the hygiene hypothesis. While it's true that industrialization brings with it better health care and fewer serious childhood infections, it also brings an obsession with cleanliness. We are not exposed to dirt at a young enough age to give our immune systems a good workout. Also, because of the high cost of energy, more homes are built with better insulation that seals in mold and dust. The hygiene hypothesis has been on the scene since people first started looking at allergies, says Associate Professor Andrew Liu. John Bostock, the guy who first identified hay fever, noted that it was a condition of the educated. He couldn't report any cases among poor people. But if dirt is a good thing, why are allergies and asthma so prevalent in poor inner-city neighborhoods? It's not just a question of exposure to dirt that reduces allergies. It has to be the right kind of dirt, says Liu. We're talking about exposure to endotoxin and good microbes in soil and animal waste. Research supports the hygiene hypothesis. There was a famous study, says Harold Nelson, where one of the protective factors for asthma was having a pig in the house. Since most of us are unable to room with a pig, we have to come up with a plan. Can we avoid allergies altogether? Can we get rid of allergies we already have? Can we desensitize our immune systems? We still don't know exactly how to prevent allergies, says Andrew Liu. We know the immune response is supposed to be a helpful one, that it's not supposed to be the cause of disease. We know that the immune system of someone with allergies needs to be re-educated. But how? It's not always clear. Liang agrees, adding, "If you are exposed to microbial products early in life, it may prevent allergies. But later in life, the early exposure may actually make things worse." There are those who argue that to prevent allergies, we should reduce exposure to harmful allergens at an early age. Others believe allergens should be administered in large quantities at an early age. Many believe it depends on the specific allergen, and food allergies may work on an altogether different principle. Confused? So are the allergists. But there is hope that allergy sufferers may one day live in a world that's far more comfortable. Suddenly, there's a booming market for products and services that were unimaginable 30 years ago. Hotels offer allergy sufferers rooms with special ventilation systems and linens washed with non-toxic products. Scientists are finding ways to get rid of the allergenic proteins in common offenders. Researchers at the University of Melbourne in Australia also claim to have developed the first hypoallergenic ryegrass. It doesn't cause hay fever. But the questions remain. Are allergies truly preventable? How much genetic engineering is feasible? And even if we can eliminate the allergens we fight today, what will our immune systems decide are the enemies tomorrow?
For A. Vanishing Venice. A city Thomas Mann called half fairy tale and half tourist trap finds itself threatened by more than just the rising tide. Kathy Newman investigates the trouble with Venice. Nowhere in Italy is there a crisis more beautifully framed than in Venice. Neither land nor water, the city lifts like a mirage from a lagoon at the head of the Adriatic. For centuries, it has threatened to vanish beneath the waves of the Acqua Alta. The relentlessly regular flooding caused by rising tides and sinking foundations. But that is the least of its problems. Just ask Mayor Massimo Cacciari, professor of philosophy, fluent in German, Latin, ancient Greek, a man who raises the level of political intellect to just short of the stratosphere. Ask about the Acqua Alta and Venice sinking, and he says, "So go get boots." Boots are fine for water, but useless against the flood that causes more concern for Venetians than any lagoon spillover. The flood of tourism. Number of Venetian residents in 2007, 60,000. Number of visitors in 2007, 21 million. In May 2008, for example, on a holiday weekend, 80,000 tourists descended on the city. Public parking lots in Mestre, where people board a bus or train to the historic center, filled with floodwater and were closed. Those who managed to get to Venice surged through the streets like schools of bluefish, snapping up pizza and gelato, leaving paper and plastic bottles in their wake. Beauty is difficult, says Mayor Cacciari, sounding as if he were addressing a graduate seminar in aesthetics, rather than answering a question about municipal policy. The black of Cacciari's dark hair and luxuriant beard complement his current mood. The preceding day, heavy rains had flooded Mestre again. Rain caused the flood, not Acqua Alta, Cacciari says. High tide is not a problem for me. It's a problem for you foreigners. End of discussion on flooding. No, he stresses, the problems lie elsewhere. The cost of maintaining Venice. There is not enough money from the state to cover it all. The cleaning of canals, restoration of buildings, raising of foundations. Very expensive. The cost of living, it's 3 times as costly to live here as in Mariano, 20 kilometers away. It's affordable only for the rich or elderly who already own houses because they have been passed down. The young, they can't afford it. Finally, there is tourism. Of that, Cacciari says, Venice is not a sentimental place of honeymoon. It's a strong, contradictory, overpowering place. It is not a city for tourists. It cannot be reduced to a postcard. If you are a Venetian who lives in a 5th-floor walk-up apartment, someone who gets up, goes to work, goes home, Venice is a different place altogether. The abnormal is normal. A flood is routine. The alarm sounds, protective steel doors come down, boots, essential to any Venetian wardrobe, are pulled on. The 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles of passerelle, an elevated boardwalk supported on metal legs, are set up. Life goes on. When Silvia Zanon goes to Campo San Provolo, where she teaches middle school, she knows it will take 23 minutes to walk there from her apartment on the Calle delle Carrozze. On the way, she crosses the Piazza San Marco, blissfully empty in early morning. I step on the paving stones and fall in love with the city all over again, she says. Gerardo Ortali, a professor of medieval history, finds his path less poetic. When I go out into the Campo with my friends, I have to stop because someone is taking a photograph of us as if we are aboriginals, he says. Perhaps one day we will be. You will go and see a sign on a cage, "Feed the Venetians." When I arrived 30 years ago, the population was 120,000. Now it is less than 60,000. The decline seems inexorable. Ortali thinks Venice will end up as simply a theme park for the rich, who will jet in to spend a day or 2 in their palazzo, then leave. It is 10 a.m., and he is headed toward a kiosk to buy a newspaper before going to his office, though you can hardly find the papers for all the tourist kitsch. Miniature masks, gondola pens, jester caps. Everything is for sale, he sighs, even Venice. The official in charge of managing the impact of tourism in Venice is Augusto Salvadori. Love is an inadequate word to describe how Salvadori feels about Venice. He's not just the city's director of tourism and promoter of tradition. He is its defender. The city is consumed by tourism, says Salvadori, seated in his office in a 16th-century palazzo. What do Venetians get in exchange? During part of the year, Venetians cannot elbow their way onto public transportation. The cost of garbage collection increases. So does the price of living. Perhaps to help, Salvadori says, we put a city tax on hotels and restaurants. Now they say tourists will not come. But I say, tourists won't come for a few euros? He glares. I cannot be worried about hotels. I have to think of the Venetians. My battle is for the city, because Venice is my heart. Tourism has been part of the Venetian landscape since the 14th century, when pilgrims stopped en route to the Holy Land. So what's so different about tourism now? I ask Ortali. Now Venice gets giant cruise ships. The ship is 10 stories high. You can't understand Venice from 10 stories up. You might as well be in a helicopter. But it's not important. You arrive in Venice, write a postcard, and remember what a wonderful evening you had. There goes another piece of Venice, Silvia Zanon, the teacher, said sadly when La Commissariat San Marco, a 60-year-old clothing store, had to move to a smaller, less prime spot because the rent had tripled. Susanna Cestari worked there for 32 years. It's like leaving the house where you were born, she said while packing boxes for the move. Since December 2007, at least 10 hardware stores have gone out of business. In the Rialto market, souvenir sellers have replaced vendors who sold sausages, bread, or vegetables. Tourists will not notice. They do not visit Venice to buy an eggplant. Tourism in Venice generates $2 billion a year in revenue, probably an underestimate, because so much business is done off the books. It is, reports the University of Venice's International Center of Studies on the Tourist Economy, the heart and soul of the Venetian economy, good and bad. Some people suggest that Venice's wounds are self-inflicted. They don't want tourists, observes a former resident, but they want their money. There is talk about implementing new policies to limit the number of tourists, imposing additional taxes, and urging visitors to avoid the high seasons of Easter and Carnival. But tourism, together with the loss of resident population and combined with the interests of hotel owners, gondoliers, and water taxi drivers who all have an interest in maximizing the influx of visitors, defies simple solutions. Let me remind you, the loss of population is not only a problem in Venice, but in all historical towns, not only Italy, cautioned Mayor Cacciari. The so-called exodus, which dates back very far in time, is deep-rooted in the lodging issue. For some, a solution to Venice's troubles already seems out of reach. It is too late, Gerardo Artali, the historian, says. The stones will remain, the people won't. But for now, there is still life as well as death in Venice. Sylvia Zanon, on her way to school, still crosses San Marco, only to fall in love with the city again. And, assuming it is in season, you can still manage to buy an eggplant. The city's beauty, difficult and bruised, somehow survives.
(4b) Searching for Shangri-La. Writer Mark Jenkins goes in search of a mythical paradise, while those who live there dream of a different life. Welcome to Shangri-La. A decade ago, this was an obscure one-horse village on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, a virtual ghost town of derelict buildings and deserted dirt roads. Most residents had moved out of their traditional homes into more modern structures with running water and septic systems. The historic quarter they left behind seemed doomed. Today, this town is one of the hottest tourist destinations in China, gateway city to the Three Parallel Rivers World Heritage Site in northwestern Yunnan Province. Tourism saved the place. The Tibetan farmhouses were rediscovered as unique endemic architecture that could turn a profit. Redevelopment began immediately. Water and sewer lines, electricity, and the internet were brought in. The old homes were rebuilt and turned into fancy shops. New shops were constructed with carved dragons and tigers to attract Chinese tourists, which they did. In a recent year, more than 3 million tourists, almost 90% of them Chinese, visited the new Shangri-La. In its previous incarnation, Shangri-La was Zhongdian, a 2,500-meter-high, 1.5-mile-high, trade route town located just east of some of the deepest and most dramatic gorges in the world. This was the remote region that eccentric botanist Joseph Rock explored in the 1920s and 30s. Rock's expeditions in search of exotic plants and unknown cultures later inspired Lost Horizon, James Hilton's novel about a remote mountain paradise. Hilton named his vision Shangri-La, which sounds like, and almost certainly is, a thin disguise for Shambhala, the earthly paradise in Tibetan Buddhism, where there is no war and no suffering. But much has changed since then. Large-scale commercial logging began in the 1950s, and by the mid-1990s, more than 80% of the area's income came from timber operations. In 1998, due in part to overlogging, the Jinsha River flooded. Nearly 4,000 people died, and millions lost their homes. In response, the Chinese government banned all commercial logging in the Three Rivers region. Forced to recreate its economy, Zhongdian turned to tourism, capitalizing on its distinctive architecture and proximity to the gorges. An airport was built in 1999, and the first major road to Kunming was finished a year later. By 2001, revenues from the tourism industry had already surpassed the previous income from logging. That same year, local officials were authorized to rename their town and county Shangri-La. The crowning tourist-catching achievement came in 2003, when the United Nations officially acknowledged the remarkable biodiversity of the river gorges and designated the region the Three Parallel Rivers World Heritage Site. Instantly, Shangri-La became the new hotspot for Chinese travelers willing to pull on hiking boots and experience the frontier firsthand. Although the nearest gorge is within easy reach of the tourist hotels in Shangri-La, almost none of the biological diversity of the Three Parallel Rivers region can be found near the city. Nor does the town possess the seclusion and serenity that the name Shangri-La suggests. So if another Shangri-La exists, a place more closely resembling the myth of our collective imagination, it must lie someplace else, somewhere further out in the remote mountains where Joseph Rock discovered his version of paradise. That's where I went looking for a truer Shangri-La. The trail near Mount Kawagerbo, the highest mountain in Three Parallel Rivers, becomes so steep it starts to switch back every 4 or 5 meters. Snow gives way to trees, then to dense forest. At a ridge, I look down into what seems to be another world. Wedged in a valley beside a steep forest is a tiny square of brilliant green, another vision of Shangri-La. It takes hours descending hundreds of switchbacks to reach the enchanted place. A man with a load of wood on his back is waiting. He leads the way beneath a giant walnut tree, past pigs and goats, over a stone fence, along a barley field, to a whitewashed Tibetan home. Up a dirt ramp we pull the leather thong. A little door opens, and we step into the 15th century. A shrunken woman in a red head wrap greets us with both hands, pours 2 cups of boiling yak butter tea, then disappears. Grandparents, parents, kids, and an uncle all share the farmhouse. All have their tasks. The uncle carrying sacks of corn and sorting horseshoes. The young mother, baby on back, tending the stove and preparing dinner. The patriarch slowly writing something in a ledger in shaky Tibetan script. Dinner is served. Rice with assorted dishes, pork fat and garlic sauce, yak meat with peppers, fried vegetables, glasses of homemade hot barley wine, apples for dessert. And then the patriarch opens a carved cabinet door and clicks the remote. There's a soccer match on TV he doesn't want to miss. The young mother pours us more yak butter tea. She is 17 and her name is Sna. She says her dream is to leave this place, the Shangri-La of my imagination, and go to the new town of Shangri-La. She's heard that women her age go to school there, and on Saturday they go shopping, walking arm in arm along the mall. Some young women's dreams have already come true. Yang Zhifang, a tall, striking 22-year-old Nasi woman, graduated from the Eastern Tibet Training Institute, ETTI, in downtown Shangri-La. There she learned English and computer skills. She now works as a guide at a local adventure travel firm. She goes back to her rural village every month, bringing money and medicine to her parents. Life for my parents in the village is very hard, she says. There is no business, just farming. The Training Institute was founded in 2004 by Ben Hillman, a professor at the Australian National University who specializes in development in Western China. The institute hosts an intensive 16-week vocational school with the objective of helping students from rural areas bridge the gap to urban job opportunities. Culture is something that's constantly evolving, says Hillman, who warns me not to apply a Western sense of authenticity to the modern Shangri-La. Economic development can rekindle interest in cultural heritage, which is inevitably reinterpreted, Hillman says. I don't think we can judge that without reverting to some kind of elitism, where wealthy and fortunate people who can travel to remote parts of this planet want to keep things locked in a cultural zoo. The real challenge for Shangri-La's ethnic minorities, Hillman says, is to develop skills for the modern world. They are traditionally agropastoralists, experts at subsistence farming, growing barley, raising yaks and pigs. But these aren't the skills that most youth need today. His students are from disparate ethnicities, but most come from dirt-poor farming households. None intend to return to a hard farm life. The Training Institute is perhaps the kind of place Snaw dreams about while she milks yaks in a freezing snowstorm. Late in the afternoon, several graduates of the Institute gather in the teacher's lounge, excited to tell their stories. The last to speak is a vibrant 21-year-old student named Tashi Tsuring. A Tibetan, he too learned English and service industry skills at ETTI and now works as a guide taking tourists to Tibetan towns and villages as far away as Lhasa. He wishes his friends back in the village could have the same opportunity he has enjoyed. Now I can play an important role in the future, he says. Tsuring looks out the window at bustling Shangri-La, his eyes following a plane descending into the Shangri-La airport. We can't see it from here, but near the airport stands a large white stupa, a sacred Tibetan monument that Buddhists walk around clockwise, the same direction a prayer wheel spins. But cars negotiating the intersection must circle the stupa counterclockwise. Consequently, women heading home to feed their pigs and men herding yaks as they have for centuries face directly into the paths of oncoming busloads of tourists. There have been collisions, but somehow it's working.